think when it comes to healing-centered practices or any kind of trauma processing practice, one of the powerful things that we can deploy is, all the work around polyvagal theory and understanding, the nervous system and interpersonal neurobiology is if folks are prepared to create the container in their body to hold more, then it's slightly easier to cope with the spiritual bypassing, right? Because you're expected to enter some kind of conversation and experience that will bring up difficult material, whether it be in the individual level or the collective level. So what you want to do is create a lot of time in the beginning of an experience or in the beginning of a conversation just to regulate and get grounded. And that could be in the form of a couple meditations, a movement meditation, sometimes a relational meditation of just checking in terms of what's coming up or what's been coming up for you. And it can be even not even related to the subject matter that you're exploring, just having people kind of really land in the space, in the community.
Welcome to the Sounds of Sand podcast. My name is Michael Riley. Today, I'm in conversation with Dr. Angel Acosta. And Angel works to bridge the fields of leadership, social justice, and mindfulness. He completed his EDD in the Curriculum and Teaching Department at Teachers College, Columbia University. His research explored healing-centric education as a promising framework for educational leadership, development, and community care. And Angel is the director of the Wounded Healers Portrait Series project. And this is a project that captures the profiles of 9 educators, community leaders, and practitioners, all of whom have dedicated their lives in some shape or form to creating a space for others to thrive, flourish, and heal. We discuss this project and a lot more on the Sounds of Sand, presented by Science and Nonduality.
Welcome to Science and Nonduality. What is non-duality?
The universal forces.
It's the collective consciousness.
Being aware.
Trauma is not the external event that happens. Trauma is the impact of that event, which is the disconnection from ourselves.
That matter is energy, energy is matter. That's what EMC squared is about.
There's a language without nouns. There is a language without subjugation. There's a language without objectifying.
But if it's recorded, then there is a collapse. But if it's not, then it's the infinite potentiality.
All right, I'm here with Angel Acosta. Thank you, Angel, for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So before we get into talking about the Wounded Healers Project, I was wondering if you could give us a bit of your background and how you came to the work that you do today.
Yes, I'm a healing-centered educator and contemplative social scientist. So I've had about 15 years in the field of education. As an opportunity to explore just the implications of being an educator and a researcher and a person who cares in this current historical moment. I currently am the director of the Garrison Institute fellowship program. It's an incredible fellowship, and the Garrison Institute, please visit. It is a former Franciscan monastery that was retrofitted to be a retreat center. And I also run the Acosta Institute, which is kind of a research and learning hub, exploring innovation at the intersection of healing-centered education, contemplative social science, and slow work. So I'm fascinated with trying to hold space and create opportunities for the community to process not just trauma, but also create conditions for thriving. That's the goal.
And what were some of your practices that sort of allowed you to weave this idea of education and healing together, like some practices that you do, like meditation, things like that?
Yeah. I think what occurred for me was about a decade ago, I started to get into the healing arts, meditation, yoga. You could throw some capoeira in there as well. Practices deployed by, different communities to find balance, get grounded. I was studying anthropology at the time. And I was really fascinated with how different communities, secular and spiritual communities, had all kinds of practices, from contemplative prayer to walking meditation, all kinds of, rituals and ceremonies and practices that enabled them to deal with just the chaotic nature of life and suffering. And I just gradually started to learn how to meditate, gradually started to pick up, a yoga practice. And I was really struck by how they impacted me physically. Yeah, at the same time, I was doing a lot of work at the graduate level in regards to social justice. So really learning about the systems that reinforce inequality, especially in the United States, but also globally. So thinking about things like racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, ableism, different structural forces that leave certain people out and distribute privilege in particular ways. So really thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is really popular now. So I was doing that almost a decade ago at the graduate level at a research center, and I was really moved by that work. I later dedicated, several years to working, helping low-income students get access to higher education. So I took that anthropology background and that diversity, equity, and inclusion background and immersed myself in creating opportunities for the next generation. But even though I was slowly learning how to meditate and slowly trying to, in Bikram yoga hot studios, stretch my limbs under those, hellish conditions, I noticed that in the work itself, there was a serious gap in the mindfulness space and in the yoga world. Folks were having a great time, finding balance, calm, ease through these ancient practices, escaping suffering, or at least trying to, via these powerful modalities. At the same time, I saw social justice activists and educators trying to change the very systems that folks in the mindfulness community were trying to escape. So I found that fascinating, that in the just social justice space, there were all these people burning out and putting their life on the line to change the very systems that generated the suffering that folks in the mindfulness and the yoga world were trying to stretch it out. We're trying to meditate through.
Right.
And I saw a gap there, and I wasn't the only scholar and person to begin to ask that question. So I decided to get more education and pursue a doctoral degree. So I went to Columbia Teachers College in the curriculum and teaching department, and got a doctorate in curriculum and teaching. And my question when I started was, what are the connections, missed connections between mindfulness-based education and social justice education? I really wanted to think about that in a really broad way. And I started that academic, rigorously academic experience with that question, and it evolved. Because what I noticed is that in both of those camps, what was common was trauma as a fundamental experience. So I became really moved by this question around what are healing-centered pedagogies? What are practices, tactics, strategies, theories, modalities, ceremonies that could be deployed in a classroom, that could be used in an educational experience with adults or within an organizational training program, that would move beyond trauma, yet would integrate both a real sense of critique and intention to transform the social structures that reinforce inequality in the case of social justice, yet also take into account the well-being and the thriving of the individuals in that experience by way of integrating mindfulness and other practices. So I felt really moved by that question, and I decided to shift my inquiry a little bit, or at least refine it. And that's the story of healing centered education in terms of how I approach that work.
Beautiful. Yeah, you use this word escape, and I think this is a common theme in when we talk about Western mindfulness. This idea of spiritual bypassing, of not facing whether it's individual traumas or collective traumas or societal injustices, not facing them head on, but using these practices sometimes to just kind of hit the eject button and just say, okay, I need to get out of this. So how do you work with that balance between allowing people that space to escape when they need to, they're in a difficult life experiences, in either in the present or in their past through intergenerational trauma, but allowing them to kind of go into the fire and witness and be with the traumas that we all share?
I think the thing about spiritual bypassing oftentimes is that it can happen unannounced. Um, so folks have difficult experiences in their lives, and when it surfaces, when they're triggered, when it emerges, activated by some kind of conversation, some kind of experience, and then there's the bypass, right? There's the avoidance.
Mm-hmm.
I think when it comes to healing centered practices or any kind of trauma processing practice, one of the powerful things that we can deploy is, all the work around polyvagal theory and understanding, the nervous system and interpersonal neurobiology. Is if folks are prepared to create the container in their body to hold more, then it's slightly easier to cope with the spiritual bypassing, right? Because you're expected to enter some kind of conversation and experience that will bring up difficult material, whether it be in the individual level or the collective level. So what you want to do is create a lot of time in the beginning of an experience or in the beginning of a conversation, just to regulate and get grounded. And that could be in the form of a couple meditations, a movement meditation, sometimes a relational meditation of just checking in terms of what's coming up, or what's been coming up for you. And it can be even not even related to the subject matter that you're exploring, just having people kind of really land in the space, in the community. And so what that grounding does, that kind of relational and emotional grounding, it builds trust. It generates a little bit more of a sense of ease, and it allows you to manage expectations in terms of how you frame the kind of experience you're trying to provide. And in particular, if you can prepare the community or the person, not just in the container of their body, but also inviting them to be gentle with themselves as they're exploring, the conversation. Like for example, with what happened in the United States after George Floyd's murder, a lot of white Americans were struck with just the realities of the state of affairs, and it generated a lot of interest in doing self work. Books like White Fragility, books like all kinds of texts really reflected the zeitgeist of this interest and this desire to explore white privilege in a way that hadn't been explored before. Mm-hmm. Now, those conversations are wonderful and great, but you want to prepare folks to deal with that white fragility, to deal with the white guilt, to deal with the disorienting feeling that comes when you become more and more aware of the kinds of socially beneficial ways in which a system is structured to enable certain access. Because that can be a lot, so you have this arrival, this revelation, this overwhelming shock in terms of just how safe it is to be in a white encased body. At the same time, that really is jarring in relation to the kinds of myths and narratives that for decades one grows up listening, that we live in a meritocratic society, that it's based on equal opportunity, that it's based on, laws that are there to reinforce that society based on merit. So that's a lot, right? That's a lot to process. It's a lot of process. So creating healing centered spaces creates the conditions for people to be able to do that work in a more robust way. Because you could argue that, in that context of race, the spiritual bypassing happens all the time, because it's just too hard to hold the reality and then also the mythic narrative and historical force that creates the condition for us to not even take it seriously, see it, be aware of it on a daily basis.
Yeah, well, there's a lot in there. So one thing that's coming up for me is, when you talked about the realization that many white people had after George Floyd, a little before, I think, some of the other police brutality videos that were happening. I remember a personal incident. I think it was around 2015 or so. It was one of these police brutality videos came out, and I said to a friend of mine, a Black woman, I was like, oh, this is, now the world is finally seeing, the brutality that's happening. And she said, no, you mean now white people are seeing it for the first time, and that was a shift for me. And I think for a lot of people, that when we talk about whiteness and the white experience, often we're saying the default experience, what we assume is the default experience. So when something like mindfulness of the body, let's say, which is a very common practice in meditation, it resonates differently, right? When you're in a white body or in a Black body, when you said you're in a safe container body by default in the society where you don't have to worry about racial profiling and police brutality at the level of somebody in a brown or Black body.
Yeah, and it's nuanced as well. Everyone suffers. Everybody suffers. So I think part of what, for me, the healing centered turn, the healing centered paradigm, which the way I define it is an extension and almost like a constellation of all the different modalities and theoretical frameworks that are trying to create a sense of balance. Right. So I include trauma studies there. I include interpersonal neurobiology there. I include mindfulness there. I include social emotional learning there. I include restorative justice there. But what all of this together, what it does, it allows us to have more gentle orientations towards ourselves with the work. Allows us to go a little deeper with others, and also capture nuance, right? Because that's important, because so oftentimes when you're having this conversation in regards to dynamics that I named in terms of race, for example, there's another conversation that gets opened up sometimes subconsciously around, oh, so our bodies don't suffer, or, sure, we have privilege, but we suffer too, we're suffering too.
Yeah.
Isn't that considered? And no, it's really just a matter of kind of being able to like slow down enough to account for all the dynamics that are at play, and then inviting us all to be more human, in this case, race. But there are so many other things that are happening, from climate change to gender. So we need more capacities to unfortunately hold more, hold more. At the same time, how do we hold it with grace?
Yeah, totally. I mean, this embracing of nuance, the embracing of being able to hold more than one thing at a time, and even paradoxes is part of the spiritual journey, I think, and that's part of the spaciousness that I think you talked about that opens up in our worldview, that we can say, oh, okay, this is true, this is true, and this is true at the same time, and I'm creating the conditions to hold both of those things as valid.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. So could you talk a bit about the genesis of the Wounded Healers Project?
Yeah, so the genesis of the Wounded Healers project came out of my dissertation, where I was exploring healing-centered education, and I learned a lot about just the ways in which different scholars, different communities, for almost 150 years, were responding to and enduring systems of imperial, colonial, and capitalist domination. So, what does it mean to be an indigenous person in the context of the US and survive reservations, boarding schools, and every single tactic deployed to save the soul and extract the Indian? So, you have to understand that imagine your language banned. The tender spiritual technologies that your ancestors deployed for millennia, not allowed, outlawed. You may be sent to a boarding school, your hair cut, your language suppressed, and then sent back to your home to be, almost an evangelical promoter of Western culture. Think about the psychological strength that required to endure that, and yet to preserve a semblance of connection to your people, to your culture. And in my research, part of what I found that some of the most powerful evidence of healing-centered pedagogies can be found in the response to colonial and imperial rule within indigenous communities globally. Right? What was that response like? How was imperfectly, right? So you can kind of preserve a sense of dignity in the face of domination and lose some of the language, but still, the fact that they're still here, the plan was only their survival up until it could sustain the system as a unit of labor. And the same goes for the Black diaspora and African Americans, that it took some serious spiritual fortitude to navigate the transatlantic slave trade, to navigate Jim Crow laws, to navigate a global systematic attempt to extract labor. And in that extraction, the lives upon lives that were lost, and the minds that were bent, and the souls that were turned, in not so positive ways. So in that work around learning more about, healing centered practices, and how they evolved, and how they got systematized, and became new ways of talking about restoring our well-being, like mindfulness, like social emotional learning, like somatic practices, somatic intelligence, emotional intelligence, social intelligence. These are new forms of talking about having a sense of well-being and awareness, and those are healing centered practices. So as I sat with all this, I came across the concept of wounded healer, which originally used within Greek mythology. In Greek mythology, you have this character named Chiron, who's a god, but he's also really deeply committed to really serving and being a servant. And in Greek mythology, he's oftentimes associated with physicians and how the physician cares for the patient. But it's very important that the intelligence of the physician in terms of dealing with their own wounds supports in the therapeutic relationship to the patient, right? So it's like this capacity to understand one's own wounds that enables you to be a more efficient, effective healer. Chiron himself dedicated his time to restoring, reparation, and restoration. So I found that interesting, and I found a couple papers on wounded healer pedagogy, wounded healer teaching, but there was a very gross undertreatment of the concept, and in terms of education. And then you saw it very used somewhat popularly as an archetype within Carl Jung's work. Carl Jung's really comprehensive psychological framework and frameworks. And Carl, my boy Carl, he used it in a similar way of naming an archetype of a person who was so deeply moved, transformed by their own wounds, that it allowed them to be a unique kind of ally to those who had similar wounds. Mm-hmm. So I was struck by that, and I noted it in my dissertation, in my doctoral research, and I just said to myself that at some point I want to do something with that concept. It sounds like a sexy concept to play with, just not during my dissertation defense. I noted it, but it wasn't a central theme. So after I graduated and I was facilitating experiences and consulting, I said, let me turn back, and it hit me really hit me really hard. We should do something with the healers, but it has to be not so academic. It has to be more arts based, more creative. And at the time during the pandemic, the field of education in the United States was experiencing the most challenging time. Imagine all these teachers teaching online all of a sudden at the drop of a dime. Imagine all these students home, experiencing what they usually can escape when they're in school, now at home with parents who are stressed, or maybe parents who are working and are essential workers and are not home, and the lack of supervision while you're experiencing online education and need all kinds of resources. So the system of education experienced a lot of trauma and stress, and the byproduct of it, one of the many, was that more and more teachers began to question whether they should be teaching. Burnout was at an all-time high. Right now, we have the highest levels of turnover in the system. So many teachers are leaving. And I was interested in the people who were staying. I was interested in what does it mean to navigate a pandemic, and have, your intestinal fortitude, tested, and yet commit to stay, and yet maybe even deploy healing-centered teaching practices to get through it and to inspire your students. So we decided to look at our network to see who were some healing-centered educators, some healing-centered leaders who were doing really powerful work. And I tapped about 9 people who I knew were doing really creative work. And then I approached a photographer, Raj Walker from Paper Monday, who him and his wife B have a studio called Paper Monday, and they do beautiful portraitures. So I decided we would do a Wounded Healers, a healing-centered portrait series and podcast. So we took each subject and took beautiful portraits, and then interviewed them, and then produced a podcast. And we built a site for it so you can see the portraits, you can hear these incredible stories of resilience and transformation. And then a couple years later, we were fortunate enough to get funding from the Kellogg Foundation, which we leveraged, and we actually framed each portrait in gold trimmed framing, and have now begun to basically administer a traveling exhibition of the portrait series. So we have the portraits physically, and my vision is that at some point, some of these will end up in the Smithsonian Museum. I'm gonna say it out loud right now. And there's also a 3D exhibition right now. You can walk through the gallery, a 3-dimensional gallery at TC Macy Gallery. Teachers College, Columbia University has a Macy Gallery, and we had an in-person gallery exhibition that was rendered into a 3D exhibition. And we're just really excited to promote and talk about this healing centered community project that's national in scope, but really is a source of inspiration.
All right, let's hear a few samples from the Wounded Healers portrait series. You'll hear the voices of Angela Cariotis and Dolores Acosta.
If you're able to create a story, then you're able to have forward movement on something. I think story is galvanizing, and that's healing because it's release, but it's also joy. Like, isn't that fun? Like, doesn't that sound fun? Fun and joy doesn't make something less. Like, you're having fun or you're laughing doesn't mean we're being light. Doesn't mean we're not being serious. So I think that there is a healing in the process of creativity too, of how liberating it is, and experimenting. Like, isn't it a great release? Isn't it healing to not worry about perfection or not having to be right or inviting failure and mourning loss, if that's what's happening, like mourning the failure and giving yourself permission for that?
You weren't born to work. I don't think I was born to work. Like, I know I have to because, capitalism, white supremacy, and all that. But I know I wasn't born to just deliver and work. I know I was born to live. I was born to love. I was born to bring peace. I was born to bring joy into the world. And we've seen that with little babies. We just lose that because of society and all the structures that are in place to hold us back. And it's just a matter of breaking that down. Once you break that down, you can see like, oh snap, there's more out there.
And what was it about the voice that called to you to create this as a podcast? Because for me, listening to it, I love the voice because there's something very vulnerable about hearing someone's first person account of what they went through and what brought them, what drew them to teaching, and yeah, discussing openly their own wounds, which in my experience at school, and I think this is pretty common, teachers did not express vulnerability. They had to be these kind of firewalls against the personal to kind of shape the students into what the outcome, the curriculum.
In terms of the use of voice and the podcast as a vehicle for promoting and treating the podcast and the public, I think what's important to note is that in the midst of the pandemic, with the social distancing policies that were deployed to cope with the virus, as many of us were apart physically, many of us were closer than ever before virtually. All right. So I think there was something about the human voice. There was something about people's voices that generated a certain level of intimacy in the context of a global pandemic that was keeping us apart. So I felt really strongly that it was important to hear the voices of each person and to get lost in those voices and feel the intimacy of their stories. And at the same time, because the history of education in the United States, especially in relation to teachers, has always been fraught. A great book to explore this, if you're curious, is titled "Teacher Wars." It's the classic struggle, not just with teacher unions, but the classic struggle of a profession that, since its inception, was feminized, in the sense that since women in our society are still belittled, degraded, oppressed, the teaching profession has suffered from that, almost second class status, and also grossly underappreciated, grossly underpaid, especially in public education. So I found it provocative to, on the one hand, listen to and curate these stories in audio form, but actually also create an experience for each subject that would allow them to really feel into their sense of dignity. And based on our research around the project, a quote from one of them, I felt like royalty, to be brought to the studio with these world-class photographers and be just like treated as a work of art. There was something there as well. So this portrait series is not just for the audience and those who will receive these voices and these images, but it was for the actual subjects themselves and the people themselves as well. And we were very sensitive to, at every step of this process, that this was a healing centered container from inception to execution. So often with any kind of project, the execution is so stressful. It's like the production is so stressful. The output, oftentimes very beautiful, but we wanted to make sure that we really curated an experience that allowed the wounded healers to feel a sense of being held, being seen, and celebrated. And I think the project, you can feel that in the project.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing to listen to and to view. And I think it's interesting to think about the teacher in the context of wounded healer, because I think for many people, the school experience itself is re-triggering of trauma or creating new traumas for them. So, I've never really heard education framed in this way as education as a healing experience for the students and for the teachers too, for the wounded healers themselves.
Yeah, and that's part of the benefit of the healing centered turn in education, the healing centered paradigm, which is part of the scholarship that I supported to promote. When you talk about things like restorative justice, for example, used in schools, that's a healing methodology. Let's say, the students that end up fighting in the classroom or in the hallways, the typical response has always been to suspend both or all involved. And restorative justice, what it did was it stopped that, and it brought everybody together through different circle work to figure out, okay, what happened here? What are the reparative and restorative things that need to be happening? What is the truth? What do people need on both ends? Victim and, quote unquote perpetrator. So that's pretty powerful stuff, especially when you think about the statistics around suspensions, and who gets suspended most and what happened to those students who do get suspended. A lot of them end up in more trouble. Sometimes the classic school to prison pipeline was a byproduct of the ways in which schools were dealing with discipline, just kind of suspending students. So then our students are suspended or ejected, basically in a sense exiled. And, what catches those students? Oftentimes the streets, other vulnerable people, other vulnerable adults. And you create a vicious cycle. So healing and healing centered practice and education deeply influenced by restorative justice. And then you see it over the last 30 years, this like integration of mindfulness in the classroom, of emotional learning in the classroom. And then also there's a parallel movement of integrating mindfulness in the workforce, integrating mindfulness and social and emotional learning in the workforce. So it's a provocative thing to hold that all these different modalities being integrated both in K through 12 education and in professional learning context, right when we're experiencing the most, what some people call polycrises, climate change, economic uncertainty, socioeconomic inequality, racial inequality, political polarization, right? So it's an interesting time to be able to hold, as you said earlier, paradox. That there we have all kinds of pedagogical resources to develop more robust ways to deal with differences, with oppression and oppressive social structures. Yet at the same time, we suffer from the legacy of unequal systems as well. So it's a beautiful moment to be a wounded healer, I think.
Yeah, for sure. It's much needed. It feels like it's going to the root of what potential change can be, which is students, which is education. Often we like you said, the education system is often underfunded and it's seen as like a second class job. And, like you said, with the sexism involved in feminizing the work. But I think everyone knows, folks that have children, like just how important quality education and for the students to have a safe and nurturing environment in the school is. Yeah. How's this project been received? Do you have any sort of stories or anything from the field of
Oh yeah,
the student? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's as far as the reception, it's been really focused on adults and teachers and practitioners,
Mhm.
and I think people have felt that it's striking a nerve in the sense that it's allowing them to find language that they've been hungering for,
Mhm.
and it's been a gateway for people to talk about the pent up frustration of navigating the global pandemic and not having had the containers or the spaces to talk about the tensions, stresses, and traumas that they endured during that. And hearing these stories allows them to think through their own experience. It allows them to reflect on their own wounded healer journey. So overall, I think it's been well received, and we're just getting really started in terms of reaching critical mass. We're just kind of in year one of putting the work out there, and we've already hosted a digital summit. We've hosted two really powerful in-person experiences. One was a contemplative workshop on wounded healing at Columbia University. And then we also hosted a week-long exhibition with the portraits up at TC Macy Gallery. And then the site is up for the world to see, and people are invited to engage it. And we're also in the process of publishing a book on the first round of portraits, which should be out in 2024. So really excited. So we're looking at it from a 3-year kind of perspective. So we hope this interview is just an invitation for folks to hear how the project is in its kind of genesis. And people will meet new wounded healers each year, and just really excited to move this along, and really grateful for the Kellogg Foundation for their support.
For sure. Yeah. No, I hope, I think a lot of people in the sand community will really resonate with this project because it does tie in a lot of interests that science and non-duality has been focused on, especially in the last few years of trauma, with the Wisdom of Trauma film, but also just our kind of, just a more compassionate space at looking at what does non-duality mean? What does true oneness actually feel like? In a direct way, and I think this project really exemplifies that.
Mm-hmm.
And the things actually, earlier you were speaking about the indigenous experience and the practices of cutting off people's hair and forcing them not to speak the language anymore. That's much of the new film that Science and Nonduality is working on that should be out in the next year or so. It focuses on that, on the resilience of those communities and what, there's just how inspirational it is to think about, genocide happening, but still surviving through that and still carrying on the cultural legacies that were not only wiped out by people, but by systems. And I think that's something that I would say white people don't quite get all the time, is that what that feels like when not just people are against you, but a system is against you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's like we've all experienced that thing where you're like trying to renew your driver's license or something, and you get stuck in like a loop of, people passing you from one person to the other, and you're like, oh man, the system's so screwed up. I hate this thing.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have entire governmental systems with armies behind them against you, it's quite something to persevere and have the resilience to get through that.
Yeah, and part of also an insight that I think it's important for listeners to sit with is that, sure, for example, I'm in this body, perceived, as a presenting cisgendered male man of color, and as I navigate and I've navigated this space in this body in society, I've experienced all kinds of benefits and also derailments. But what's important to note is that for many people of color right now, we're entering kind of a renaissance, powerful renaissance. So historically, you've had these systems that have been deployed against us, but it's firmly clear that we are not just worthy, that we have a sense of dignity. I don't have time to even carry that kind of legacy. So it's an interesting moment for many of us who've arrived at certain maybe spiritual or emotional maturity that feels as if like we're being held by ancestors in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
There's a palpable feeling like that in a lot of people. I feel it in my bones. I mean, and it's different because I used to have that heaviness all the time, navigating all these different predominantly white spaces and having to perform. I don't do that anymore. It's not my work. And
Lovely.
that's the power of working on things like a Wounded Healer project, is because it constantly reminds me of my own woundedness, but also my own commitment to healing. And that's kind of where I am now. It's just somewhat unfazed.
It's beautiful. It's very inspiring. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So the Smithsonian, that's coming up. You mentioned that.
It's coming. It's coming. Don't tell them though. We gotta.
They might be listening. So you don't think it's spam if you see a Smithsonian email come in your inbox.
No.
Cool. Anything else coming up in this fall that you want to connect with people?
Yeah, I mean, we'll be hosting a lot of events at the Garrison Institute. We'll be hosting a retreat exploring contemplative leadership at the end of September. We'll be hosting an online international healing-centered education conference in early October. In November, we'll host another retreat at the Garrison Institute with Dr. Yolanda Seeley Ruiz, one of our wounded healers, exploring her methodology, the archaeology of self. And we'll close out the year teaching an online course, the Healing-Centered Primer, which is a Healing-Centered Education 101 course that anybody can take. It's a 3-week experience, exploring theory, practice, and research in the context of healing-centered education. And then lastly, next year in February, we'll be launching the first healing-centered education certification program through the Acosta Institute. So look out for all of that. A lot of good work coming up.
That's exciting. Yeah. Nice. We'll have links to all that in the show notes. And thank you, Angel, for being on the show. And I hope we continue this relationship with Science and Nonduality and all the work you're doing.
Of course. Thank you so much. And we'll be in touch.
And thank you for listening to The Sounds of Sand. We invite you to explore more of our talks, dialogues, videos, articles, events, and offerings through our website, scienceandnonduality.com. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please consider becoming a member to access our massive library of SAND content, available exclusively to SAND members. And we would love it if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Google, and Spotify, and share this episode with your family, friends, and all sentient beings. Be well.